When you think about the world of academia, you probably picture brilliant minds, incredible research, and passionate teaching. And all of that is true. But behind the curtain, it's also a world of just intense pressure. Pressure to publish, to get funding, to manage huge teaching loads, all while mentoring students. And that relentless demand is fueling a pretty serious crisis, professor burnout. But to really get a handle on it, we first have to understand what it actually is, and maybe more importantly, what it isn't.
So what is burnout really? Well, it's not just feeling stressed after a tough week. The science defines it as a very specific syndrome that has three key parts. First, you've got emotional exhaustion. You know that feeling of being completely and totally drained, like your emotional gas tank is just empty? Second is depersonalization, which is this cynical, detached feeling you get towards your job and even the people you work with. And third, there's this sense of reduced personal accomplishment, where you start to feel ineffective and you kind of lose sight of the value in what you're doing.
And I really want to be clear here. This is not just some small niche problem we're talking about. The scale is just staggering. I mean, look at this number. One single major review analyzed data from studies covering over 43,000 faculty members. So yeah, this is a massive phenomenon, and researchers are, for sure, taking it very seriously.
All right, so to really get to the bottom of this, here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the scale of the crisis itself. Then, we'll zero in on who is most vulnerable. After that, we'll get into the super important imbalance between job demands and resources, unpack the science behind it all, and finally, we'll ask the big question: what on earth can be done?
Okay, first up, the academic burnout crisis. It's so important to get this straight. Stress might be what you feel before a big deadline, right? It's temporary. But burnout, that's a chronic state. The research really frames this as a systemic problem, something that's been building for decades as higher education has gotten more competitive, the pressure for productivity has ramped up, and there's this constant demand to do more, often with a lot less support.
So that brings up a really important question. Does burnout affect everyone in academia equally? Well, the research points to a very clear no. It turns out certain demographic factors consistently put some people at a much higher risk than others.
When you look at the data, a pretty clear pattern starts to emerge. Younger academics, those with less teaching experience, and folks in lower-ranking positions, they consistently show a higher risk. And a lot of this is tied to precarious employment. The instability of not having tenure or being on a short-term contract. It just creates this constant underlying stress. Now, the picture with gender is a bit more complex. A lot of studies find that women tend to report higher levels of that emotional exhaustion we talked about, while men sometimes report more of the depersonalization, that cynicism part.
But look, demographics are only one piece of the puzzle. The real engine driving burnout is found in the workplace itself. And this brings us to what you might think of as a constant tug-of-war between job demands and job resources.
And this is really the crucial question, right? Because, okay, we know who is at risk, but that just gets us to the next logical step. What is it about their environment that's actually fueling this fire? What's the real driver here?
So on one side of that tug-of-war, you've got job demands. These are all the things that drain your energy. Work overload is the one you hear about most often, that endless juggling of teaching, research, and all the admin work. But it's not just the sheer volume of work. Things like internal conflicts with colleagues, role ambiguity, like that classic tension between your teaching duties and your research duties. And of course, the relentless publish or perish pressure, they all just pour gasoline on the fire.
But then, on the other side of the rope, you have job resources. These are the good things, the things that build you up and protect you. Having real social support from your boss and your coworkers is a huge buffer. So is feeling a sense of satisfaction and recognition for your work. And having autonomy, some control over what you do and how you do it, plus the ability to actually have a life outside of work. Well, these things don't just reduce stress, they actively build engagement.
So here's the bottom line. When you look across dozens and dozens of studies, these three factors just keep screaming from the page. The number one psychosocial driver? Internal conflict. The demand that gets cited over and over? Work overload. And the most damaging thing to be missing? A lack of support. Burnout just skyrockets when you get that perfect storm of all three.
Now, this whole idea of a balance between demands and resources, it's not just a casual observation. It's actually a core part of some really well-established scientific theories. So let's take a quick look at the frameworks that help us understand the mechanics behind all these feelings.
Because what the research makes crystal clear is that burnout isn't just some random, chaotic feeling of being overwhelmed. Nope, it's predictable.
It follows a pattern that scientists have been modeling and testing for years to figure out exactly how it works.
And the most influential model out there is the Job Demands Resources model, or JDR for short. It's a really elegant way of looking at things. It basically says that burnout is the direct result of that imbalance we've been talking about. It's what happens when the demands of your job consistently overpower the resources you have to deal with them.
And this model gives us two very different paths. Path number one, high demands plus low resources. Well, that's a one-way ticket to strain and burnout. It's a health impairment process. But, and this is the really fascinating part, path number two shows that if you have high resources, even with those same high demands, you can trigger a motivational process instead. That leads to engagement and feeling energized. So the big takeaway isn't that demanding jobs are automatically bad. It's that demanding jobs without the right support are toxic.
There's another key theory that adds to this, called the demand control support model. It really zooms in on two specific resources that are just absolutely critical: having control over your work, autonomy, and having good social support. This model says the absolute most toxic work environment is one where the demands are high, but you have no say in your work and no one has your back.
Okay, so we've unpacked the problem. We've looked at the science. We get it. But understanding the problem is one thing, actually solving it is another. And that brings us to the most important question of all. What can we actually do about it?
Well, the research is pretty clear that you need a two-pronged attack. On the individual side, of course, things like stress management, developing coping skills, and getting counseling, they're all really important for helping people manage. But, and this is a huge but, that can't be the whole solution. That's like putting a Band-Aid on a systemic issue. The real, lasting change has to happen at the institutional level. Actually reducing workloads, creating supportive environments, having clear promotion paths, and giving faculty a real voice in how things are run. And that brings us to what is really the central message from all of this research, and it's captured perfectly in this quote. Burnout is not merely an individual response, but an indicator of structural imbalance within the academic labor system. In other words, it's not a personal failing, it's a symptom of a system that's out of whack.
So let's just quickly pull all the big ideas together. First, burnout isn't just being stressed. It's a specific, defined syndrome with three parts. Second, it's driven by that fundamental imbalance of high demands and low resources. Third, things like your age, your rank, and your job security can make you more vulnerable. And finally, and this is the most important one, real solutions have to focus on fixing the institution, not just on telling the individual to cope better.
And that leaves us with one last really big question to think about. If burnout is a symptom of the system, if it's the warning light on the dashboard of academia, then maybe the real challenge isn't just about helping people manage the stress. Maybe it's about having the courage to ask if we can redesign the system itself.